Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you all here. My name is Regine, and I teach at UMass Amherst in Western Massachusetts. And I'm here today with Nathan. Nathan, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Nathan Phillips, and I'm from Newton, Massachusetts. I'm an electric ratepayer, and I teach and do research at Boston University.
And we're here today just to give you a little bit of an overview of what this whole grid is and how to make sense of some of the really complicated acronyms that you'll see if you start reading about it or learning more about the grid. So in this first slide, we just wanted to show you how much of our electricity in the United States is made up of fossil fuels. So this is coal, oil, and natural gas that is very polluting for our environment and bad for our public health. So in this chart, you can see that while we've reduced our coal usage in the United States by quite a lot, that's the yellow line, we've still increased our natural gas, which is the light blue line, a lot over the last couple of decades. And that's due to the fracking and the drilling that they're doing in different parts of our country for natural gas. So while we've made some progress in the decrease of coal, we still are very, very dependent on fossil fuels for our electricity. Next slide. This is how it looks here in New England, in the 6 states in New England. This chart, you can see the coal is the black line here. It's been going down, which is good because we've been closing a lot of coal-fired power plants. But as you can see, the blue line is the increase in natural gas that is used to generate our electricity. So when we say the grid, what we're really talking about is a complex set of wires and poles and generators and policymakers and institutions that are instantaneously delivering an electric current to you, to everywhere, all at once. So it's kind of like mind-boggling to think about how generators from all around are putting their energy onto these poles and wires and into the grid, and at every single moment, all around, people are using that energy in their homes, at work. Most of the net imports is actually hydropower from Canada through different lines that come through the north into the United States. So it depends on whether or not you call that renewable. I think it's less carbon intensive, but there are significant ecosystem disruptions that result from large-scale hydropower and dams. Okay, so that's the grid. And so remember that the grid always has to be balanced. The same amount of supply that goes on the grid has to be pulled off the grid at the same time, because if you don't have that magic mix, then you get all sorts of things like congestion, breakdown, blackouts, etc. So that's why it's a huge technical and engineering feat. Next slide. So I'm not going to go too much into the history of electricity and how we got the grid that we got in the United States, but there's 1 or 2 points just to make about our grid, which is that in the past, it used to be that one company, your electric utility company usually, owned and operated all of the generators. So everything that generated your electricity, like the coal plants, the hydropower plants, the fossil fuel plants, they owned those, and then they owned the transmission wires and the distribution poles, and they were in charge of getting the electricity to your house. That was one company in the past. And the government would regulate that company to make sure that rates were reasonable. That means that you weren't paying too much, and that everybody had universal service, so nobody could be excluded from getting electricity in the past. But what happened is, in the next slide, over the course of the 1970s and 80s, with the broader deregulation movement in the United States, and also with a series of crises. We had a huge blackout in New England in the 1960s. That prompted policymakers to start to think about changing our structure. And I think and these are just some key acts and policy legislations from a book by Leah Stokes about this historical process. But in short, there was a move to try to get more renewable energy onto the grid. So instead of relying on nuclear power plants and fossil fuel power plants, more renewables were allowed to come onto the grid, which was a good thing. But what that meant is that there was also a restructuring of the whole system. So John, you could go to the next slide. And here, I'll pass it on to Nathan to describe how the electricity system was restructured in the 1980s.
Thank you, Regine. So those policies that came out in the late 70s and 80s had the effect, as Regine mentioned, of allowing other kinds of energy sources like renewables to come onto the grid, cleaner energy, but also it really restructured the whole organization of the grid. And so it went from this top diagram where the ownership is from the front to the end, all owned by one entity with really centralized power. Vertically integrated is a term used, to one in which on the lower figure these were split up. The ownership was distributed across different entities. And so that is the grid that we have more now. And it has solved some problems. It has introduced other kinds of problems as well. But that's just a snapshot of how the structure changed.
I'll just say one more word. So now these generators here are often owned by private companies, sometimes with ownership headquarters outside of the United States, and they're solely interested in generating profit, these companies. And the utilities still exist to provide the transmission and the poles and the wires and to get the electricity to your house, but these generators are now private investors and companies that are looking to make money.
Thank you. Next slide. So around the same period of time, these individual little grids owned from the beginning to the end, those were restructured, and similarly regional grids were forming. And this was promoted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that promoted the formation of what we call ISOs. That ISO stands for Independent System Operator. We can talk about what that all means. There's another term that is almost synonymous with ISO called RTO, Regional Transmission Organization. They're often interchangeably interchangeably. And so the United States is basically broken up into these regional grids, and you can see there in the upper right, the ISO-NE stands for the New England Grid, Independent System Operator of New England. That's 6 states of the New England region, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Next slide.
Great. So this is a picture of what our ISO looks like in its headquarters. And our headquarters are in Holyoke, Massachusetts for the ISO New England. And you can see the operators there looking at where all the generation is coming from, where it's going, what wires it's going through, and who's using it. That's what they manage every second of every day to make sure our electricity is stable and reliable. So in the next slide, the ISO New England has a website, and they have 3 main goals that they talk about. The first thing is they operate the grid. So what that means is it's easiest to think about the ISO as an air traffic controller. So remember when you're flying in a plane and there's lots of planes in the sky, you need someone to say, okay, it's your turn to land now. It's your turn to take off now. Well, the ISO is kind of operating like that for electricity, saying, okay, it's time for you to put your electricity onto the grid, and then making sure that it gets pulled off the grid at an equal rate. They also administer these new markets called wholesale electricity markets. So remember when we talked about how the generators were now private companies? Well, what they have to do is they have to bid into a new market that the ISO operates to say, okay, we can provide this much electricity at these times at this price. And the market, the generators that are the most cost effective, so that means the cheapest, get actually called to service the grid and put their electricity onto the grid. So that is a huge market institutional process that the ISO manages every day. They do it the day ahead, they do it real time, they look at weather forecasting, they look at all sorts of things to try to predict how much electricity we're going to need in every single minute of the day, and then get enough supply to meet that demand. And then third of all, they plan for the future of the grid, which means that they're looking at how our renewable landscape is changing, how our weather and our climate is changing, and they're trying to predict what type of new infrastructure we might need and other types of investments. I'll just note here, what's really important for our work with Fix the Grid is that clean energy is actually not part of the ISO's mission statement. Their mission statement is to provide reliable electricity, and they have a vision to include more renewable energy, but it's not part of their actual mission.
I have an analogy to their position. It's kind of like Facebook or social media that says, we're a neutral platform. We don't choose this or that, but there are consequences of the claim to be neutral. They say every electron is like a soybean. They're all the same. Fuel neutrality is what they say they have to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that. We can go to the next slide now. Who oversees these ISOs? So we talked about how these ISOs got created in the restructuring to manage the markets and this new process. The acronym to remember here is the FERC, F-E-R-C. That's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's a federal body, regulatory body, and it does a lot of things. Like it manages interstate gas pipelines, it manages hydropower licenses, but what's really important for us is that it also oversees ISOs and RTOs, all of them, not just ours here in New England, but all of them. And they make, and the ISO has to make sure they comply with FERC rules, including the rule to provide reasonable and just rates, so to make sure the cost for us, the ratepayers, doesn't get too high. I think I'll pass it to Nathan to talk a little bit about how decisions get made at ISO New England.
Great. So as you can see, this there's 6 boxes that is supposed to represent the elements that interact with the grid, the stakeholder groups. And I want to just point out that us here are called the end users. We're 1 box out of 6. And, you know, some of us think the role of the end users who are paying for all of it really should be more than just 1/6. So a lot of these are the power plants, the generators. Those are mostly private companies. The transmission line owners, they own those big wires and poles that are carrying. Other suppliers and end users involved. So where would the utilities like Eversource be in there? Supplier probably. So folks in the Green Roots area with Eversource Electricity, they're going to be in that supplier category, right? And they're going to be, that's where they're doing their thing in this NEPOOL group to try to get what they want to get done, done. Did we talk about NEPOOL? Oh, okay, so let's talk about what that NEPOOL is. Next slide, please. Yeah, so NEPOOL stands for the New England Power Pool. So power pool, like a collection of power generators and all of these different six groups that have some interest in the electric power that is delivered ultimately. There's problems with it. It started off as a industry group, industry association, and it is not open to the public. Their meetings are not open to the public. You can't just walk in and sit down and listen to their meetings, even though so much of the decisions that they make affect the public. They are very close. In fact, NEPOOL really created ISO New England. When the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said we are going to need to have these regional transmission organizations set up, well, who was the entity that created the structure? It was NEPOOL. And so there's a very tight relationship between NEPOOL and ISO New England. The decision-making process, the transparency, the voting, it's pretty opaque. As this last thing says, they trade votes on issues and make symbolic suggestions, and that's how decisions get made. So right now, it's very not open to our input, but meetings like this are ways in which we can learn about these entities and start to make changes.
Great. So the ISO says they're neutral, but the reality is the choices they make about how the markets operate and how to build out the grid, they are deeply, deeply affecting what our future grid is going to look like. And so here, this quote really just highlights that ISO's decisions are important, and they often are increasingly coming into tension with what the states, what our state governments want to see. So on the next slide, we have a couple more acronyms. I'll describe those in a minute. But the punchline is that our states, like I come from Massachusetts, and we have this thing called Renewable Portfolio Standards, which is basically when the legislature decides how much of our electric grid has to be renewable or clean energy. And our states are trying to increase the amount of clean energy that's on the grid because it's better for public health, it's better for the environment, and so what's happening is the states are pushing for more renewables and a different grid, but the ISO is very much beholden to the fossil fuel generators and the existing status quo. So you're seeing more and more of a tension here in New England over the past 3 or 4 years as the ISO and the states kind of battle out their positions on this issue. And what you can see here are two organizations that are also, and we talk about alphabet soup, there's so many acronyms in this world, but the first one is NESCO. It's the New England States Committee on Electricity. And that's really important because NESCO is one of the bodies that has one representation from each New England state. And they're the ones that are trying to meet and then push the ISO to adopt more climate-friendly policies and rules. The other one that's important is the New England Conference on Public Utility Commissioners. Do you want to talk about NECPUC? Nathan, do you know a lot of, yeah.
A little bit. Myself being from Massachusetts, we have the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, and they regulate the gas and the electric distribution systems, and have been not very transparent, I would say, in many different ways. It varies from state to state, so I actually don't know a whole lot about how the other states' public utility commissions operate, transparency, things like that. I will just say this: in the last year or so, the Massachusetts DPU has undergone quite significant change in at least rhetoric and language, if not action. So things are in flux, at least in Massachusetts.
So what we're basically leading towards is that all eyes are increasingly on ISO New England. And this is a quote and the title of a really great op-ed that Stephen Botkin, who is here and who gave the welcome, he wrote this. And this was already 3 years ago when he identified that there are all these problems with transparency and governance in our ISO, and that more and more people are watching. The states are watching, we are watching as ratepayers, and we're pushing to try to change how they operate. One of the ways we're pushing to change is through the ISO Consumer Liaison Group. And so Nathan and I were elected with the help of No Coal, No Gas and other coalition members to this body that is supposed to liaise or provide information to the public, to ratepayers. And in the past, this organization has been represented by predominantly ratepayer advocates and generator interests. And we've been trying to introduce more community voices, energy and environmental justice issues, and a dialogue that will help to reform our grid. Do you want to say more about the CLG?
Yeah, I would just say that as an advocate, I love being here because I want to talk about changing things, but also as an elected member of this CLG, I feel like it's my job to be here because our job is to have whatever you have for us to get communicated to the board of the ISO. So any frustrations, any complaints, anything you have for us, tell us. And then we will go to the ISO board and push that message to them.
Yeah. And just to flag, our next Consumer Liaison Group meeting will actually be in Holyoke, Massachusetts on June 4th, and we'll be sending you all information. We are increasingly trying to host them in energy and justice areas and get diverse perspectives in front of the board. So let's review. We did a lot today in just a very short time in terms of throwing out a lot of acronyms and a lot of different bodies, but I hope, and on the back of your sheet, your handout, you actually have these listed out just so you can remember them if you come across them. But we kind of introduced some of the key players on the grid. And on the next slide, what we're going to get into in the afternoon is a little bit more about this problem of the lack of transparency, the black box decision-making in the ISO, and what ratepayers, people like us, can do, on the next slide, to really promote more transparency and reform so that our perspectives and our visions are taken into account as the grid transforms in this really rapid and important way.